to field those questions for us too.
Welcome back. So tonight we are going to look at the archaeology of Jesus and the Gospels. And of course, we're not going to cover everything, but we are going to look at the highlights and some of the most important archaeological finds related to the life of Jesus. Now, the Gospels, of course, there are 4 of them. And if you look at the amount of content, the 4 Gospels comprise almost half of the entire New Testament. So we see there's a message there even by the sheer amount of content. 4 different Gospels, almost half the New Testament, is telling us that the life of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, is very important. And of course, Jesus is the central figure of Christianity. He's the most famous person that ever lived, and the calendar system of almost the entire world is based around his birth and life. However, there still are people today who refuse to acknowledge that Jesus even existed, that he was a historical character. I will say that in scholarship, there are no academics, there are no experts in the fields of archaeology or ancient history who would deny the existence of Jesus, but they would dispute many things in the Gospels as to their veracity, their truth. But you do often hear this idea that, oh, there's no historical evidence that Jesus ever existed. Maybe in a Bible is Lit class in high school, maybe in a newspaper article, maybe in an internet forum, things like that. It's around there in popular culture, some documentaries even. But that is categorically false, and we're going to look at some of the information that relates to that, but also to many other details within the Gospels, because it's important for us to know some reasons why, beyond just Jesus existed, that things that he did that are recorded in the Gospels actually happened, that the Gospels are reliable, that we can trust everything that is in those 4 accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus. Now, first, a quick look at the primary sources that we have for Jesus, which are, of course, the New Testament Gospels. Now, Jesus is mentioned in other books of the New Testament, other Christian literature from ancient times, and historians, some of which we will look at also. But the main sources are the 4 Gospels. And thanks to the recovery of many ancient manuscripts over the last 2 centuries, we actually have very, very ancient manuscript copies of the Gospels. So I've put here just the earliest copy that we have of each of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, just to give you an idea. And you can see that all of these come from around 100 to 200 AD, somewhere there in the 2nd century, with the earliest one being this fragment of the Gospel of John, maybe as early as 90 AD there. So that would generally be considered our earliest fragment of any Gospel manuscript. So that's really important. If you recall, when we were looking at the book of Exodus, the earliest manuscript we had of the book of Exodus was from the 3rd century BC. So that's a huge distance between when Exodus was written and the date of the earliest copy that we have. But with the Gospels, it's totally different. We're looking at decades between when they were written and the copies that we have today. And so we're able to say, with these early copies and with the high number of copies of the Gospel manuscripts, that the text itself is extremely accurate. It has not been changed. This is something that was claimed against the Gospels. Really, in the 19th century, this happened a lot. But it cannot be done so today if people would just acknowledge the facts. They used to try to say, oh, okay, well, the New Testament says this or the Gospels say that, but it was changed by the early church. It was changed by the medieval church. But we can go back now and look at these earliest manuscript copies and we see, no, it hasn't been changed. It has not been changed in the last 2,000 years. So the words themselves, we can say those are the ones that were written. Now, did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John get all those facts right? We're going to look at many of the reasons that tell us, yes, they did so. But I think it's also important to look at a couple of passages in the Gospels that tell us the mindset and the methodology of the Gospel writers. It tells us that what they are writing is intended to be true history, and they're putting themselves on the line. They're signing the document, so to speak, saying that I attest that this is true. So Luke begins his gospel by saying, since many have undertaken to compile an account concerning the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word from the beginning passed on to us, it seemed fitting to me also, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write down an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth. So Luke tells us that he went and he got all these eyewitness accounts of things from the beginning of the life of Jesus. And he didn't just rely on one source. Okay, he's getting many sources, and he's getting sources from people that were there, that saw these things, that were familiar with Jesus and the disciples and the area. And then he says he investigated it very carefully from the beginning. So he starts at the beginning, goes all the way through, and he says that he wrote it down in orderly sequence. So it's in chronological order. It's not a mishmash of facts all over the place. It's very logical. And he says the reason is so that you may know the exact truth. So he tells us right there, he's trying to convey to us the exact truth and in chronological sequence. So that is Luke's intent. He has very good methodology as a historian. And then John, he says something a little bit different, but it's also intended to help us understand his objective and his methodology. He says in John 21:24, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. So he's saying he was there as a disciple, and he's testifying that these things happen, and he's essentially signing his name in an official document. I'm putting my name and my testimony on the line here, that these things actually happened. So we can at least go into it saying, we know what they wrote is what we still have today, and we know that the author's intent was to give us the exact truth. The setting for the Gospels is the Roman Empire during the first century. Okay, it starts in the end of the first century BC, goes into the first century AD. And the Roman Empire, at the time of the birth of Jesus, looked a little bit different than the Roman Empire during the ministry of Jesus and his crucifixion and resurrection. So you can see some of the different colors here representing different types of provinces and also different types of kingdoms that were under the influence of Rome. But you see Judea is way over there in the far east. So it's on the eastern edge of the empire. You see the border here. And at the time of the birth of Jesus, it was what's known as a client kingdom. So it wasn't an official province of the Roman Empire yet. It was ruled by a local king. He was ultimately subject to Rome, to the Senate and the emperor, but they had a little bit more independence. So that was King Herod the Great. Now that changed several years later in AD 6 when the Romans directly took it over, and then a Roman governor was ruling the province. And so later on in the Gospels, we see Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor. That's because the situation had changed a little bit. Now, Augustus, he was the emperor at the time of the birth of Jesus. Very well-known figure in history, one of the more well-known historical figures probably. And he had this very long tenure as governor, as emperor, starts in 27 BC. So he's been in power for a long time before Jesus is even born. And then he is the emperor through the childhood of Jesus. And then his heir, Tiberius, becomes emperor, and that's who is in power during the ministry of Jesus. So he brought about what's called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And this is something very interesting from sort of a macro or broad historical perspective about the time of Jesus is that when he was born, he's born into this Roman Empire. And at that time, everybody spoke a form of Greek. And you could use all the same Roman money. You could travel on the Roman highways that were a lot safer than usual. And you had the borders of the empire defended by these legions. So you had common language and currency and much faster and safer travel. And this made the spread of the gospel much, much easier than in previous times or even in later times. And Paul talks about this, and he talks about it. It's kind of like the perfect timing when Jesus arrived. So Augustus is mentioned by name, though, by Luke. Luke, by the way that he writes, he emphasizes Roman political figures. He talks about all the different emperors and the governors and other types of political leaders. He kind of writes in what we might call a Hellenistic or a Roman historical style. So we see him emphasize the Romans. We look at Matthew. He talks more about the Herods, the local Hebrew rulers. But Luke says in Luke 2:1, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth, or all the Roman world. And we'll look at that in a minute, but there he's giving us a chronological marker that the Caesar is Augustus. And what happens just before the birth of Jesus? There's a decree for an empire-wide census. Now, if we go over to Matthew, he has a different audience. He has a Hebrew audience, so he emphasizes some slightly different people. He talks about Herod, or Herod the Great, the king of Judea. And he started his reign way back in 40 BC. He actually took over Jerusalem in 37 BC. So he had to struggle against the previous dynasty, the Hasmoneans, and took over the area with the help of Rome. And Herod rules until his death in 4 BC. So Matthew mentions him as the king at the time when Jesus was born. And of course, he is the one who's involved in attempting to kill Jesus, assassinate Jesus when he's a baby. So this gives us another chronological marker. It tells us Jesus is born while Herod is still king. Well, we know then it's before 4 BC and, of course, after 27 BC. But we've got some other information in there to help us narrow it down. Herod is very well known in ancient historical circles. He was an incredible builder. So much of what Herod had built is still standing today. Not just things like the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, but there are impressive buildings all over the Middle East, outside of Israel even, because he had influence beyond that area. He built a lot of things to honor the Romans, especially Augustus, but he was just very good at construction. Many of the things he built were very useful also, like aqueducts and so forth. Herod has a really interesting ancestry, though. So on one side of his family, he was Nabatean, and on the other, he was Edomite. So the Nabateans were to the east of Israel, and the Edomites were to the south. So his family actually came from outside Israel, just adjacent to the land, but they were oftentimes enemies of the Israelites, and yet here's Herod then being put in as king of Judea. So he wasn't super popular with the people, and it's quite possible that he did that rebuild of the temple as a way to try to gain favor with the people in Judea. And I think to some degree it worked. It was apparently one of the most beautiful structures ever built in ancient times. And it gave a lot of people jobs also, and had a lasting legacy. But he wasn't the rightful king of Israel. He did not come from the line of Judah. He wasn't even an Israelite strictly. He adopted Judaism, but he seems to not really have taken it to heart, because he did quite a few things that violated the Mosaic law, such as building temples for the Emperor Augustus. Well, when Herod died, he was in quite poor health, And according to Josephus, he died in 4 BC, and soon after some eclipse, which a lot of astronomers think it was somewhere around the 12th or 13th of March, based on looking back at astronomical criteria. And fairly recently, his burial place was discovered. There were some different ideas about where he was buried, but they'd been excavating at a site called Herodium, which is south of Jerusalem near Bethlehem. And they finally found this mausoleum of Herod, and they found what seems to be his sarcophagus there. Well, when they found it, it was smashed like this, which probably was done in ancient times because the people generally hated him. So Jesus is born before the death of Herod, right? In fact, he's born a bit before that, because there's the whole thing with the Magi and pursuing Jesus and trying to kill Jesus. So Luke tells us about the census. And what Luke also tells us in chapter 2, verse 2, is that the Roman who administered this census was a ruler named Quirinius. And it says that Quirinius was a ruler in Syria, and this was the first census that he administered. Well, if we go back and look at Roman records, we find out some really interesting things that both demonstrate the accuracy of Luke and help us to hone in a little bit more on the general time when Jesus was born. So Augustus's records, he talks about empire-wide censuses that he ordered, 3 of them. They were in 28 BC, 8 BC, and 14 AD. Well, we can throw out those 2 on the end. They're nowhere near the death of Herod. So we see this 8 BC is when he orders it. All right, well, things in the ancient world didn't travel as fast as they do now. So it would take a while for that message to get communicated all the way in the east to Judea, and then for Joseph and Mary to decide, okay, we need to go down to Bethlehem, and then make their way down there, and they finally register for the census, and Jesus is born. So there's a bit of a lag time there. So it's probably, at the earliest, the very end of 8 BC, maybe, though, in 7 BC. Well, there was, though, this empire-wide census. That's something else important, because that's what Luke tells us. And this has been something that has been debated or claimed as an inaccuracy of Luke. But we have the Roman records themselves that talk about this. We also have various census documents from the Romans that tell us about the way in which they administered these censuses. And one of them was that you had to actually go back to your home where you were registered. Now, in this country, voting today is done differently, but in times past and in many countries around the world, you actually have to go to where you're registered to cast your ballot. You can't just do it from wherever you live or wherever you are. And it was like that for the Romans with the census. You had to go back to your home. You would fill out this piece of paper. Soldiers would come around and collect these things. And it would have your name and sometimes your occupation and your family on there, things like that. So the military was involved in administering the census. That's important too, because Quirinius was a military leader at this time. He was, we might call him a general. They called them a legate. But he was commanding legions in this area of Syria and beyond at the time of this census and around the time of the birth of Jesus. So it makes sense that he would be the one that Luke mentions, because he's the highest ranking official. Now, there was another governor in Syria at this time, but he was the civil governor, okay? He was what we would think of more as a governor, not a general. But that branch of the government was not involved in administering the census. So Luke gets those interesting details right. There's also this Latin inscription that I think is very important to this whole issue of the census and Quirinius. It was found in Beirut, which at the time was part of Roman Syria province. And it talks about how this officer, this military officer, was involved in a census that had been ordered by Caesar Augustus, and it was being carried out in that area by the legate Quirinius. So we have some more evidence of that census. Quirinius involved in the census right there in Syria province. And you might ask, well, why Syria province? Because, again, at that time, Judea was a client kingdom, not its own province. So it was under the jurisdiction of Syria province for certain matters. So Luke's getting a lot of important details right, helps us to situate the birth of Jesus, also gives credibility to Luke's account. He's putting himself out there as a historian by mentioning all these names and events, very, very specific things. Well, in the first century, it would be pretty easy for people to go and check if he was right on that. Today, not so easily. We've lost so many of those records. But back then, they could easily discredit Luke by just going and looking at the Roman sources. So Jesus then is born, and the site of his birth traditionally is ascribed to underneath the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, which was a church constructed in the 4th century by order of Emperor Constantine to commemorate the place where Jesus was born. And this was part of a campaign of Constantine to preserve and commemorate many of the important locations in the Bible, but especially connected to the life of Jesus. So Constantine had sent his mother, Helena, there, and also his architect, and they didn't go pick out the spots themselves. They went and asked the local Christians. Specifically, they asked the Christian leaders, the bishops, and they said, do you know where this happened? So they go and ask in Jerusalem, where was the tomb of Jesus? They go to Bethlehem. Where was Jesus born? Well, there's a couple of reasons why I think these churches, these ancient churches, we call them Byzantine churches, have the correct locations for these places associated with Jesus. And that is, first is because there was a continuous Christian presence in the land from the time of Jesus. Now, in Jerusalem, most of the Christians left during the first Judean revolt against Rome, but this was only for a few years, and then they came back. So people are living there the whole time. They're small cities, small towns. Bethlehem was a tiny village. Jerusalem was maybe 100,000 people at the time of Jesus, if that. And people didn't move around so much like they do today. They weren't moving from Jerusalem to Jaffa to Capernaum and so forth. Most of them just stayed in the town where they were born and their grandkids and so forth. So they know where an important event happened down the street, and they tell their kids about that, and their kids tell their kids about that. So it wouldn't be very difficult to preserve the memory of those locations. But there's a second reason, and that is that in the early 2nd century, around 130, 135 AD, Emperor Hadrian was trying to eliminate Christianity. And he had seen that previous emperors failed by using different tactics. Nero, for example, persecution and killing Christians. So he thought, that didn't work, I'm going to try a different method. At first, he thought that he could debate some of the Christian leaders and convince them that Christianity was false. He was very fond of Greek philosophy, and so that was the first thing he tried. Well, it didn't work. So the second thing he did was he seems to have tried to erase the memory, the historical memory of Jesus, and assimilate some of these places with the Roman gods. And so he built temples and shrines, Roman temples and shrines, over these important places in the life of Jesus, like the place of the birth of Jesus and the crucifixion and the tomb and the pool of Bethesda and the pool of Siloam. So he actually helped, though, preserve that, because he built those about a century after the time of Jesus, and then by the time that Constantine's delegation got there, the Roman shrines and temples were still standing over that spot. So they just told them, yeah, it's here where this Roman temple is. Eusebius, the famous church historian, talks about this specifically in relation to the tomb of Jesus, which we'll look at later. So there is a cave underneath the Church of the Nativity. Actually, you go to the back of the church and then down. Now, I don't know 100% that this is the cave in which Jesus was born, but it's quite plausible. I think it at least is in that very small area. Bethlehem, again, not a big place. And we have a variety of ancient sources outside of the Gospels that talk about the location of the birth of Jesus, such as we've got Justin Martyr talks about how it was in a cave, and we have Origen talks about how Jesus was born in a certain cave, and then Jerome talks about the grove or shrine to Adonis that was placed over that by Hadrian. So probably right around there, if not that spot. You might ask, why would it be a cave, right? It says there's no room for them in the inn. Well, what it actually says is there's no room for them in the guest house, and then it talks about the manger. Okay, so what's a manger? This is the manger. So it was a stone-carved animal trough. So we know then that it was a place where animals were kept. Well, they often kept their animals in caves underneath or adjacent to the houses because it was a natural protection from the elements, but you didn't have to build a whole barn for the animals. You just use what's naturally there. So this was very, very common. And again, we have some of these 2nd and 3rd century sources that talk about the cave. Well, what about sources outside of the New Testament, outside of Christian sources talking about the birth of Jesus? This is the first extra biblical source that we'll look at from antiquity. Well, this comes from a guy named Celsus, who was very anti-Christianity, and he is being responded to by Origen. But Celsus is very interesting because he knows all these facts about Jesus. And then he's got some of his own interpretations or opinions on things. But what he talks about, first of all, is he knows about Jesus, okay? So he knows about the existence of Jesus and his name. He knows about the virgin birth. He says he invented his birth from a virgin, but he knows about it. He knows that he was born in a certain Judean village of a poor woman of the country. Okay, so Mary was from some village. We know that. It says Jesus was born in a village of Judea. Now, this is important because Bethlehem was in Judea, but Nazareth was in Galilee. Well, Jesus spent most of his life living in Nazareth. He's called Jesus of Nazareth, but he was born in Bethlehem. So he knows that he wasn't born in Nazareth, which is, interestingly enough, something that some modern scholars have tried to argue. Oh, Jesus wasn't born in Bethlehem. He was born in Nazareth. The Gospels just had to insert that in order to have it connect to the prophecy in Micah 5:2. But even some ancient people opposed to Christianity know Jesus wasn't born in Nazareth. He knows also about this weird situation with Jesus' parents. Now, of course, Joseph is like, what's going on here? Mary's pregnant. Okay, oh, well, God tells him what's going on, but he was a little concerned there, right? And he wasn't sure what he was going to do. Well, Celsus basically uses the human explanation for it, and he says, oh yeah, Mary got pregnant by some Roman soldier thing, and so there was a whole scandal and all that. Well, it could have looked like that, it could have looked like that to Joseph before he received this divine message, but he knows about all these different things, even knows that Joseph was a carpenter, okay? Really, really important about some of these details that even somebody very opposed to Christianity is aware of in the 2nd century. Well, after the birth of Jesus, there is this visit of the Magi. Now, we don't know the names of the Magi. I wouldn't say that we have archaeological evidence for the Magi, but we know something about Magi in general and how this whole thing in the narrative makes sense from a historical perspective. We do have a very interesting 2nd century text that was recently rediscovered in the Vatican, and it's called The Revelation of the Magi. And it's basically a pseudepigraphal or apocryphal text that talks about the Magi and their trip from their perspective. Now, it doesn't mean that it's all historically accurate, but it is early and it's worth a look. And it tells us some things like there were at least 12 Magi, okay? So it doesn't assume that there were 3. like is sort of a pop culture idea because of the three gifts, although the Bible never says there's three of them. It says they're from some place called Shir. Now, that might give us a helpful clue as to where the Magi are from. Magi was a class of wise men, advisors, dream interpreters, astronomers, astrologers, kind of like ancient scientists in a way, but they originated in Persia, but they were also very popular in Babylon. We actually see Magi in the book of Daniel, and if you look at the Greek version of it, the Septuagint, that word is also used. So they could be from the area of Babylon or Persia, but this mentioning Shir suggests that it was actually from Persia. There are many places in Iran where the names of the places have this component, Shir. Well, in there it says that they are awaiting a centuries-old prophecy. Some people think this might be a reference back to the time of Balaam, Numbers 24:17, talking about this star, possibly. Maybe they had read Daniel and they were looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. We don't know for sure. There's no specifics, but it's very plausible to me that the Magi had access to the Old Testament and they had some kind of expectation of that from reading it. But in this text, the star is described as either an angel or a divine light. So it's not a star up in the sky. And if you look at the details in Matthew, it's also suggestive of that because it appears and reappears, and then it guides them to the specific house where Jesus is. So a star, as we call a star, cannot do that, obviously. But this word, aster, in Greek is also used of angels or of some kind of special divine guiding light. And then they visit Jesus, and I believe it was in Nazareth after they went back there. If you read through Luke, and he's 2 years old or less. All right. This is one of the earliest pieces of artwork depicting the Magi. And, next slide. And you can see these strange hats they have on here. So this is sometimes known as a Parthian cap. So this also kind of tells us the general area of where they came from. And this is east of Judea province, and it is kind of in the general area of Persia, but also even farther west in the lands that were ruled by the Parthians at that time. There you see they're bringing the gifts. Jesus is seated on his mother's lap, and there's the star. Well, part of that narrative also has what's called the massacre of the innocents. And this is something that is very criticized as well. Because people say Josephus doesn't talk about this, and therefore we don't think it happened. Well, who is Josephus? Josephus was a historian of the later first century. So he was born in Judea, and he was a participant in the first revolt against Rome, but then he saw that they weren't going to win, so he surrendered to the Romans. He found favor with the emperor, and he was adopted, actually, by the Vespasian family, and he became an official historian for the emperors. And he wrote multiple works, the most famous and largest of which is the Antiquities of the Jews. And he has a huge amount of useful information in there, especially for the time of the first century, but also even before that. Well, Josephus does give a lot of historical details, but he doesn't cover everything. And why this wouldn't be in Josephus is because who dies here? A few babies in a tiny village. All right, now to Josephus that's not important because he's focusing on major political events. He does talk about other assassinations, and some of which are very relevant to this story, like Herod assassinating his own sons. In fact, he did this right at the end of his life, right around the time that Jesus was born and the massacre of the innocents would have occurred. Why did he do this? because Herod grew extremely paranoid and he thought that someone was going to take his throne, like Jesus or like his sons. And so what's he doing? He's eliminating everybody who he thinks will challenge him or can challenge him. And that's why he was trying to get rid of Jesus. He wasn't trying to kill Jesus because he thought Jesus was the Messiah and he wanted to stop that. He was trying to get rid of him because he thought Jesus was the king who was going to take his position. So we have strong parallels for this type of behavior from Herod. But we do have a couple of ancient sources that seem to mention this event also. One of them is called the Assumption of Moses. Seems to be from the 1st century. And it basically compares Herod to the Pharaoh who was killing the male Hebrew babies in Egypt prior to the Exodus. So essentially saying Herod is killing babies, male babies. So it knows about that. And then the infancy gospel of James. This is obviously not canonical, but it gives some of the same information in Matthew 2. And then there's a later Roman source, the Saturnalia, and it has this interesting quote here that says, "I would rather be Herod's sow or Herod's pig than Herod's son." And he is essentially saying that it's safer to be Herod's pig because he's not supposed to be eating pigs than his own son because he's killing his sons. But he also talks about earlier, he had ordered all the boys in Syria under the age of 2 years to be put to death. So this one expands it beyond what actually happened. Of course, Herod didn't say everyone in the whole region, every boy 2 years and under. But they know about this, okay? They know about the killing of these male babies 2 years old and under. Well, the family of Jesus flees to Egypt. We don't know exactly where in Egypt they went. The Gospels don't tell us. There are no really early sources that tell us. There are some traditional places that have ancient origins in Egypt today. This is just a picture of one of the many. The Abu Serga Church in the 4th century in Cairo area. There are other places too. So we don't know for sure. We could only guess. But going to Egypt was, of course, and then coming back from Egypt was, of course, theologically significant. But it also makes sense from a historical perspective because Egypt was adjacent to Judea, so it's close. Same language. There's a community of Jews there. Same currency. And yet it was out of reach for Herod. Herod had influence to the south and the east in the Edom and Nabatean regions, and also to Syria in the north, where he had some political allies, but not in the province of Egypt to the west. So it was the best place for them to go in the immediate area. When they return, we hear that they don't go to Jerusalem, they don't go to Bethlehem, but they go to Nazareth. And part of the reason for this, from Joseph's perspective, is the transition in leadership. So Herod has died. That's why they say, okay, it's safe for us to come back. He died in 4 BC. And then his kingdom was split between his sons. There was some dispute with the will, but after all that settled into place, Archelaus was the one who got the biggest share of the territory. So he was over Judea and Samaria. And then you had Herod Antipas, who was ruling in Galilee. And then you had Philip just over to the east. And then you had Salome, the sister of Herod. She got some of these tiny little spots that she gave up to the Romans fairly quickly. So Joseph hears Archelaus is reigning over Judea. And he decides, I'm not going there. So he goes back to Galilee and to Nazareth. Well, we know that Joseph had very good reasons to avoid Archelaus because Archelaus was an extremely violent ruler, probably much worse than his father. Maybe he didn't have the same type of paranoia, but he was killing people left and right. One really horrible example is There was a crowd of Pharisees during Passover that got rowdy and probably started a riot, but instead of just trying to settle things down and maybe using some rods to hit people and some crowd control, he executes about 3,000 of them, we're told by Josephus. So he goes to extreme measures. And in fact, he was so terrible that the Romans kicked him out of his position and exiled him to Gaul in AD 6 and came in and took over the province with a Roman governor. So there was direct Roman rule. So it was a good choice to not go back to Judea there. Antipas was ruling in Judea, and he was a much more benevolent ruler, and his reign lasted a whole lot longer too, until 39 AD. So he only stopped then because he kind of was the victim of some political change. But this coin here is one of the coins of Herod Archelaus when he is ruling as what they called an ethnarch, ruler of the people. That was his title. So you can see Herod and you can see ethnarch on there. And all of the Herodian rulers issued their own coins. You can see their names and their titles on there. So that is one way that they are attested archaeologically. Of course, they're all also talked about in some of these ancient historical sources, such as Josephus or Philo. When Jesus goes back to Nazareth, they settle in there. And Nazareth used to be kind of a problem archaeologically when we didn't really have evidence for first century Nazareth. And some critics of the New Testament would say Nazareth wasn't even a village at the time of Jesus, so this is just another made-up part. But there have been various excavations that have taken place there and a lot of discoveries, and so what we know that, yes, it indeed was a village in the first century. It was also a village that was occupied by Jews who observed the Mosaic Law. Those are some major details that are necessary just to show the historicity of this part of the narrative. There's a Byzantine church that was built there to commemorate the spot where Jesus' childhood home supposedly was. We don't know if it's accurate or not. This was later than the Constantinian era churches, but it at least gives us an example of a first century house. It does preserve a first century house that was there. Jesus eventually goes to Capernaum when he starts his ministry and makes that his home base for a while. Well, Capernaum was also a town occupied in the first century on the coast of the Sea of Galilee. Much of it has been excavated. Two buildings in particular are very significant. The first is the synagogue. So if you go there today, you will see this synagogue. It's this very elaborate, well-preserved white building. You can see it right there. Well, this building was built in the 4th and 5th century, but directly underneath it is the 1st century synagogue. So you see in the photo on the right, underneath the white stones, there are these black stone blocks. And those are preserved to a height of around 3 feet generally, underneath this newer synagogue. So the older synagogue from the time of Jesus was right there in the same place. And this is a typical practice for synagogues in the ancient world. When an earlier one got destroyed or damaged, or they wanted to build a new one, they would build right over the top of the previous one. And so we have there the 1st century synagogue, somewhat preserved. We know that it dates to the time of Jesus because of pottery and coins that were found in the structure. Well, the second building is the house of Peter. And this is something that is specifically mentioned in the Gospels. Matthew 8:5-14, for example, talks about the story with the centurion, and then it says, when Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. So Peter's home right there. And then Mark 1:29 says, immediately after they came out of the synagogue, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew. Okay, so Peter and Andrew were brothers. They're living there in this house. They moved from Bethsaida across the lake. seems to have been the family home of Peter's wife. And Mark also tells us immediately after they came out of the synagogue, so it seems to be close in proximity. Well, if you go to Capernaum today, it'll take you about 10 seconds to walk down the main street of the town, the Cardo, to Peter's house. If we look at this house, we see that it seems to have been built in the 1st century BC originally, and that it was used as a house until later in the 1st century AD when it started to be modified. So they changed the walls of the house, and then they plastered the walls. And then in the 2nd century, Christians start inscribing things on the walls, various things praising the Lord Jesus Christ. A couple of them mention the name of Peter. And so it became one of these house churches of the earliest time of Christianity. Of course, back then they couldn't build official churches, so they met in homes. So this one essentially got converted from Peter's house to the place where the church met, probably when Peter left for Rome. And it continued to be used as a church until Christianity was legalized in the 4th century, and then they built an official church building around this. And so it's been there since then. Jesus, of course, is known as a teacher in the Gospels, but in popular culture. But he was also talked about as a wise man and a teacher in ancient sources from the 1st and 2nd century. A couple of those that are important to note. Josephus, he says, at this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. So, disciples, he's a teacher. He's a wise man. He knows about Jesus. We also have from the late 1st century, about 73 AD, a guy named Serapion, who was a philosopher. Now, he was not a Christian, but he wrote this letter to his son, and he talks about various examples. One of the examples he gives is Jesus, and he says that nor did the wise king die forever. He's referencing back to the crucifixion of Jesus. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. So he also knows about the teaching of Jesus. And of course, this is not very long after the crucifixion, 40 years. And this guy doesn't live in Judea, and he's not a Christian, but he knows about the teaching of Jesus. He knows about the disciples of Jesus. So things were already quite widespread within a few decades of the ministry of Jesus. Besides teaching, Jesus, of course, performed miracles. 2 of these happened at pools in Jerusalem, the pool of Bethesda and the pool of Siloam. Well, the pool of Bethesda is very interesting because John describes it as having 5 stoas or 5 porticos. So a stoa is basically a hallway that is open to the elements on the side. It's got columns, and then it has a roof. So people were reading this, and they were wondering, what kind of shape was this if it has 5 of these? And they were thinking, maybe it's some kind of 5-sided pool. But when it was excavated, then they found out exactly what he meant, and it was a pool in approximately a rectangular shape, and the 5th stoa was dividing the upper and lower sections of the pool. You can see there on the left. And on the right, you can see some of the stairs that led down into the pool. Of course, that miracle where Jesus heals this man who couldn't walk, and then he gets up and walks. So John describes this accurately. John describes this before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Tells us he was there. He knows what these things looked like. This is also one of the places where Hadrian built a Roman temple to try to obscure the memory of Jesus and attribute things to the Roman gods. So Hadrian built a shrine or a temple to the god of healing, Asclepius. So they knew about the healing miracle there. Well, what they tried to do was connect it to the Roman gods. One of the artifacts that was found in this context was a foot that had an inscription thanking Asclepius there. So that was the Roman practice. You would go to this temple and you would make an offering. You would sleep there, and then if you got healed, you would come back and you would give them something that looked like the body part that was healed. So in this case, it was a stone foot. It was pretty elaborate, probably much more than most of the things that were given. The Pool of Siloam is another place. This is in southern Jerusalem. And this is the healing of the blind man. This was fairly recently discovered, 2004. The Pool of Siloam actually has what's called the lower pool, this one, from around the time of Jesus, and the upper pool that was put in place when Hezekiah carved the new tunnel. Well, now this whole pool is going to be excavated, so you'll be able to see the entire thing, and most likely it is totally preserved, because what has been excavated so far is you can see all the steps and the different levels of the pool there. So that will be quite the sight pretty soon. Another thing that we could connect to miracles was Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans. Luke 19, 43 and 44 especially. He talks about the siege of Jerusalem and about leveling the city, not leaving not one stone upon another. And then, of course, he also talks specifically about the temple being destroyed. Well, if we go to archaeology, we go to Roman history, we see Jerusalem was besieged by the Romans. They destroyed the city. They completely obliterated the temple. And on the right there, you see some of the stones that were up on the Temple Mount from the buildings there that were pushed off of that platform. And they've just left some of them there today for people to see the remnants of that destruction rather than clearing them all. Another miracle was the raising of Lazarus. Now, there is a traditional tomb of Lazarus in Bethany. Maybe it's the right one. It is a first century tomb of the correct type. Of course, this miracle got Jesus in a lot of trouble with the religious authorities because they actually thought that he performed miracles. Well, what do people in ancient times say about Jesus and miracles? Is it something that we only see in the New Testament? No, it's not. So let's look at some different perspectives on that. Well, Celsus, in the 2nd century, we read about him before, right? He explains Jesus' miracles in this way. He talks about how Jesus had gone to Egypt, and then he says, Jesus, having there acquired some miraculous powers on which the Egyptians greatly pride themselves, returned to his own country, highly elated on account of them, and by means of these proclaimed himself a god. So Celsus says, yeah, he performed miracles. His explanation is that he learned the magic of the Egyptians in order to do it. He also, by the way, says that Jesus claims he was God. So he knows about that. I don't know if you've ever heard this claimed, but there are a lot of teachers and even scholars who say things like, Jesus in the Gospels never claimed to be God. I mean, that sounds ridiculous, right? But it's actually out there quite a bit. Well, even Celsus, who hated Christianity, he knows that Jesus said that he was God. All right, so he doesn't deny the miracles of Jesus. Here's another source, Justin Martyr. He's writing to the emperor Antoninus Pius, and he says that Jesus performed these miracles, you may easily be satisfied from the acts of Pontius Pilate. So he's saying to the emperor, you can go look at your own official Roman records, and you can see that some of the miracles of Jesus are recorded in there. Now, Justin Martyr was a Roman who originally was a pagan, but he converted to Christianity, and then he became sort of the first apologist, or at least one of the earliest ones. And he is saying that you can look at the Roman records. Like, he's not appealing to Christian sources even. He's saying, look at what your own Roman official records say. And then you can find out about that. Some sources from Judaism, like the Mishnah, they talk about Jesus allegedly practicing sorcery or magic through the power of the devil, and that he led Israel astray. And so, because of that, he's violated the Mosaic law, must be arrested and stoned. All right, you go back and look at the Mosaic Law, and sure enough, there are things in there about practicing sorcery and magic. So what are they saying? Because we also see this in the Gospels. They're saying, yeah, Jesus performed these miracles, but they're telling us, we think that the power he got that from is Beelzebub, or from the devil, all right? So they're ascribing a different source, but they're also not denying that he performed the miracles. And then finally we have Josephus. And Josephus kind of gives a neutral perspective on Jesus in many ways. But in one passage he uses this word, this Greek word that we can define as something incredible, paradoxical, or contrary to expectation. And I think that's very fitting of talking about a miraculous work. So again, he is not denying. So we're looking at some totally different perspectives here, but all of them are affirming that Jesus performed miracles. They just have different explanations for it. It's very different from the modern world today, or at least half of the world, where the supernatural is essentially disqualified. Everything has to be materialistic. But in the ancient world, that was not so, and really about half of the world today still doesn't think like that. But in our region of the world, that is common. Well, all of this gets Jesus into trouble, and we get to the trial of Jesus and then the crucifixion and the resurrection. So let's just conclude with some things about the crucifixion area and the resurrection. Okay. So in the trial, Jesus encounters some key people. Pontius Pilate, of course, Caiaphas, the high priest, Annas, the high priest, Herod Antipas, who we talked about briefly. Well, Caiaphas, a very interesting discovery there in the 1990s. He was known from the writings of Josephus as a high priest, but then the family tomb of the Caiaphas family was discovered just outside of the walls of ancient Jerusalem. And some of these ossuaries had inscriptions on them. So an ossuary is a burial box. And this ossuary right here was the, this ossuary here was the most elaborate that they found in the tomb. Actually, it's one of the most elaborately decorated ossuary, period. But it had an inscription on it that said, Joseph, son of Caiaphas, in Aramaic. So that was his full name. So this indicated to us that it was the bone box of Caiaphas the high priest, because it's the right time and location and name and very elaborate, wealthy tomb. But then there was another discovery, even more recently, that was the burial box of his granddaughter. And it gave us some more details about this family. And it says that Caiaphas was a priest of Maaziah from Beit Imri. So he's from this ancient priestly line. You can see back in 1 Chronicles 24. So it tells us a little bit more about Caiaphas, and that he was actually from a legitimate priestly line. He wasn't just a total usurper, as many of them in the Roman period were, because they were appointed through political favors at that time. Pontius Pilate, he is also attested in ancient writings like Philo, Tacitus, and Josephus. Pilate issued coins while he was the governor of Judea. So you can see some of them there. They honor the Emperor Tiberius. But there have been a couple of artifacts discovered that attest to Pilate himself, his name. First one there on the left was a stone inscription that was discovered at Caesarea. Now that's on the coast, and it was the Roman capital of Judea at the time of Jesus. Jerusalem was the traditional capital, of course, but the Romans made their own capital that was connected to the sea and away from all of the religious things of Jerusalem, but they maintained a presence also in Jerusalem. So this inscription was some kind of dedication to the Emperor Tiberius. So he talks about a Tiberium. Might have been a temple to Tiberius, we're not sure. But then it has his name, Pontius Pilatus. and his title, Prefectus of Judea. So that was a type of governor. So there we have that. This was discovered in 1961. Suddenly we've got archaeological attestation of Pilate. It actually was commissioned by Pilate himself. Well, very recently, this ring with Pilate's name on it was just published. It was actually found not too long after, excavated not too long after this stone block, but it wasn't known until very recently. But it was a ring that would have been used probably by someone in Pilate's administration, not by Pilate himself. It was found at Herodium, south of Jerusalem. And you can see there, it's got these Greek letters on there, Pilato, okay? That's the form of Pilate's name that we find in the New Testament also. Herod Antipas was someone else that Jesus went before in that trial. Why did he go before Herod Antipas? Pilate didn't want to deal with this situation. He thought, all right, Antipas is the ruler of Galilee. Jesus is from Galilee. Maybe he can deal with it. So he sends him to Antipas, who was in Jerusalem at the time. Here's one of Antipas's coins. It says there in Greek, Herod the Tetrarch. So that was his title. Luke uses that also, Tetrarch, Herod the Tetrarch of Galilee. Well, Herod didn't want to deal with it either. Really, he didn't have the authority to make any sort of pronouncement. So he goes back to Pilate at the Praetorium, which has been discovered. So the Praetorium was the governor's residence in Jerusalem. You can see part of it today. Some of it was excavated in the 1970s. But you see there this gate, this entryway, and then up on the left is what I think was the Gabbatha and the stone pavement. So Gabbatha means raised place. And if you can see right here, okay, so people can stand right here, and they're not actually inside the building. But then Jesus and Pilate are up here, so everybody can see them, and they can be yelling at them, but they don't actually have to enter the building, so they don't become ritually unclean, so that they would have to then go through all those rituals. But they didn't have time to do that because Passover was about to start. So they don't have to enter this Roman building, but they can still watch the trial and yell at them. Well, the stone pavement is mentioned by John, and here's some remnants of that, the stone pavement, and up here on the Bema area. So we've got a lot of these places from the trial of Jesus and the people involved in it that are attested archaeologically and known today. What about Jesus himself? Well, I think that Jesus is attested on the James ossuary. So this was somewhat of a controversial artifact, but after many years of scrutiny, there are a lot of scholars who think this is legitimate, and what the studies have essentially shown is that it's a real bone box, a real burial box from first century Jerusalem, and it's got this ancient Aramaic inscription on it that says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, those were common names at the time, but this particular combination of them is not so common. Also, naming the brother of the deceased is almost an anomaly. Of all the ossuary inscriptions, there's only one other one that mentions the brother. So that tells us this brother is very important. Well, that other one that mentions a brother doesn't mention a father, doesn't mention a profession, so it was the only identifier for the person. This is getting really specific, telling us this Jesus must be an important person. Well, that combination of names, the only people that we know of from any historical sources at that time are Jesus Christ, his brother James, their father Joseph. So this, in my opinion, would be our first century Jerusalem attestation archaeologically of Jesus. And even more recently, there's another inscription that was found, comes from the late first century, maybe 50 AD or so. It was found in the harbor of Alexandria. It's a cup, a magician's cup probably, that was used. And it has this dedication on it that says, through Christ the magician. So remember Celsus there talking about the magic of the Egyptians. Magic was extremely popular in Egypt. They heard about Jesus and his miracles. They thought that he was some kind of magician. They could harness him for power. When we read some of these early Egyptian magical papyri, they talk about Jesus also. One of them says that in the way that you cast out demons, one of the formulas is you invoke Jesus, God of the Hebrews. Well, go to the book of Acts, and you see in Ephesus, the sons of Sceva try this, right? It doesn't work out for them, but they try it because people know about Jesus performing miracles and casting out demons. So that, I think, is attesting to the title Christ there in the first century. So Jesus is crucified, and this is the earliest artistic depiction of the crucifixion. It was found in Rome, dates to about 100 AD. So there is early non-Christian artwork about this crucifixion, actually. Again, people know about the life of Jesus and the things that happened. We see it recorded in some early Roman sources like Tacitus from about 115 AD. He says, "The persons commonly called Christians who were hated for their enormities, Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius." Serapion, who we looked at before, mentions the execution of Jesus. Lucian, who also was very anti-Christian, talks about Jesus being crucified in Palestine. He uses Palestine rather than Judea because by his time they changed the name of the province. So people know about the execution, the crucifixion of Jesus. And then Jesus is buried. Where is he buried? We'll finish with this. I would say he was buried in the tomb that's in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Why? All right, well, first we talked about these early Byzantine churches and Hadrian being involved in trying to obscure these locations. So there was a Christian tradition going back to the time of Jesus. And there's early writings about this. But if we look at some of the details of the tomb, there's some very specific things that not only match, but are unique. So this is the type of tomb that it was. Go back one slide. This is the type of tomb that it was. It's an arcosolium tomb, so it's carved into the rock, and then you have the rolling stone that seals the tomb. These were for wealthy families. So this is a tomb of the Herodian family, at least that's what it's called. It's the only one of this type in Jerusalem from the first century that's still preserved in a way that you can see everything. That's why I use it as an example. This is inside the tomb of Jesus. So this is the burial bench, or specifically, that is some marble pieces that are laid directly over the burial bench. When National Geographic did some remodeling and restoration of the tomb, they removed those pieces, and so for the first time in centuries, you could actually see the limestone burial bench, the original one that was carved. This gives you a top-down view of the tomb. Oops, sorry. So you can see what it looked like if you're looking at it from an aerial view, basically, but it's cut. But you can see here's the opening and where it would be sealed. And you walk right in, and there's one chamber, and then on this side here is the burial bench where the body was laid. Well, from what you can still see in the tomb today, this is the entryway. They've actually opened up the tomb so there's an entry and an exit. But you enter through there, okay, same kind of entryway, and there's the burial bench on the side, and then that's it. It's just one chamber. It's a single chamber. Well, that's really important because there are no other single chamber tombs of this type anywhere in the area. It's the only one. And that's because these were normally family tombs. They would carve rooms off of that initial chamber, and then people would be buried as they died, the whole family, extended family sometimes. But the tomb of Jesus, nobody else used it. It was the new tomb, right? And so they just buried him in there, and no one else reused it because the Christians revered it, and then Hadrian built a temple over it. So that's something that's really unique. In that area, even within the church today, there are other first century tombs. So you can see that it was a graveyard in the first century. It was actually a quarry that was turned into a garden and a graveyard about the first century BC. So it's got a lot of interesting things going for it, even though there's all sorts of stuff that kind of dresses it up. Well, then there's the resurrection, of course, the most important event. And I think the Romans knew about this, and they spread the word on it. And one of the things that attests to that, I believe, is called the Nazareth inscription, who gives a very specific penalty for anybody who goes into a certain kind of stone-sealed tomb and removes a body, it says, with wicked intent. So it sounds like they're targeting this specific type of tomb and a particular type of crime associated with that. They're not talking about tomb robbers. They're not talking about people going in and stealing stuff out of the tomb. They're talking about someone going into a stone-sealed tomb, which was not all the tombs. Only very few of the tombs were like this. And taking the body out, and there's some kind of intent behind that. Well, if you go back to Matthew 28, 11 through 15, you see how the soldiers were paid off to spread this story that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. And then it says it's circulated among the Romans to this day. And so years later, this is issued, and it seems to be both a reaction to the resurrection story and also probably an intention to make sure nothing like that ever happens again, because Christianity was causing problems in the Roman Empire. I mean, we even see in the time of Claudius, when this was probably issued, it says, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, Emperor Claudius, expelled them from Rome, 49 AD. So, which is also talked about in Acts. So this is very early. Already, even over in Rome, it's starting to cause some problems. So he wants to put a stop to that. People knew about the resurrection very early on. Josephus talks about the resurrection. Now, if you go to what's called the Agapius version, it doesn't sound so Christianized. He doesn't say he believes that Jesus is the Messiah. But what he does say is he says, they reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah. All right, so he's just reporting what other people said, but he knows about it. We could also go to Tacitus. He talks about these rumors, and then he talks about this mischievous superstition of the resurrection in Christianity. Repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, but through the city of Rome also. So it's going everywhere. It's causing problems. So what do we see? Many, many aspects of the Gospels are corroborated by archaeological evidence. If it's locations, if it's inscriptions about people, titles, events, then we see these ancient historical sources that are talking about Jesus, and they're talking about different parts of his life. All of them are attesting that these things actually happen. What is the main difference then? The main difference is who they're attributing the miracles to, and if they actually believe that the resurrection happened rather than people are just saying that it did. But from an archaeological and historical perspective, we can tell people, yeah, there's evidence that these things happen. Now, when you get to the supernatural and the theological, that's where you can't prove it with history. But you can say, these sources, the Gospels, have been shown to be reliable in the ways that we can check them. So we have lots of reasons to trust them in their theological and supernatural claims. All right, well, we will conclude with that, and I'll be happy to take any questions about this content or really anything related to biblical archaeology.
For the education I didn't know I needed. And so all day long, it's been amazing. So thank you so much for being here. We were wondering if you could share a little bit more personal stuff about like you and like what it looks like, what you've found, what you've experienced. Like, do you go and then go home and research all the things? Like, tell us a little bit more about that journey, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Sure. Yeah, so I always liked ancient history and didn't immediately know that archaeology was a thing, that it even existed. I think the first archaeological site I saw was right before third grade, but I didn't really know what an archaeological site was. And then a couple years later, I read about the excavation of Troy and the Iliad. And so then I understood, oh, people actually go to places and dig this stuff up out of the ground. But I got very interested in biblical archaeology probably early high school, and then decided eventually I wanted to try to study it in college. So I started working on excavations my freshman year in California. It wasn't biblical archaeology, but it was teaching me the process and the methodology. And then a few years later, I went and did my first excavation in the Middle East at Hatzor, which is a site that's fairly prominent in the Old Testament, in the book of Joshua and in Judges and in Kings. So that was kind of my introduction into that, and continued on in school and kept working at different excavations. And so now what I do is I dig once a year generally, and then I go home and do a lot of research at libraries or with my own library, and process those things that have been excavated, or try to put together ideas from what other people have dug up and see what the connections are with the Bible, and hope to find new things. I've worked in Jerusalem, for example, and one of the things that we discovered there that's sort of relevant to what we were talking about tonight is a first century priestly mansion. So it would have been a home maybe of a high priest, definitely of a wealthy person from the priestly class. So it's kind of an example of what the house of the high priest would have been when Jesus goes to the house of the high priest. And there have been, there's probably 3 pretty good examples of those that have been excavated in Jerusalem now, so we don't know which one it would have been specifically, but they were quite elaborate mansions. They're multi-story. They had bathrooms with a nice bathtub in them. They had their own ritual baths next to that. They had a big kitchen. So you can see they were pretty fancy houses. People lived very differently in that upper class of the priests versus kind of your common people like the fishermen. So that's some of the stuff I've worked on, but other stuff from Old Testament times to another thing we discovered a few years ago was an altar from the time of Joshua, approximately. It was a Canaanite altar, so we could see what those looked like when we hear about the different sacrifices that the Canaanites were involved in. Well, what's an altar look like for them? Where did they put it? Usually at a high place, and they built it of these cut stones, right? Well, we read in the Mosaic Law, they weren't supposed to build altars like that. The Israelites weren't. They were supposed to make them of uncut stone, right? So they're differentiating themselves from the people in Canaan. Welcome.
All right, I got one for you. So recently, when I've been speaking on Sundays, we've been walking through the book of Ezra, and it kind of jumped out to me personally when Ezra finally comes on the scene in chapter 7, the priestly line that he's a part of, and kind of going back, Aaron was given a promise that his priestly line would continue, I think forever, and then his grandson, was that Eleazar? I can't remember the name, who killed people with a spear in the tent, some incest, or not incest, but guy sleeping with a foreigner wife, killed them, and God said, okay, the line will continue through this guy. I think it was Eleazar. Then later through Zadok, and then later through Hilkiah, and then later through Ezra himself. And my question is since you're talking about Jesus here, and of course we know he's the line of Judah, and then in the priestly sense, he's from the order of Melchizedek, But I'm wondering how close, and if there's any chance of potential Levite blood in Jesus also, because we read that Zechariah and his wife, she is a daughter of Aaron. Mary's related to her. It was just very interesting. I don't know if we can know, but have you ever heard of that or thought of that?
I haven't really thought of it, especially. I mean, we see that both lines, Mary and Joseph, are traced back to David's line. So, I mean, I'm sure there's some relatives in there since they're all pretty close. But yeah, I really haven't thought of it much.
All right. So I did a little archaeology in Israel myself, and while I was there, I noticed that we were getting a lot of political pushback. The Israeli Antiquities Authority. The chatter was that they were more afraid of what they would find rather than give us permits to go and find things. Has that released at all? And especially with the presence and the press releases of people like Graham Hancock, who are out on Rogan's show and constantly coming up with new ancient civilization discussion points. Has that released you to go and do what you need to do, or more discoveries that prove more of what you're researching? Thank you.
I don't think any of the stuff has changed really, and I don't think Graham Hancock would affect that. There is a lot of political background to excavating in the Middle East, whether it's Israel or any other country really. So, yeah, a lot of them, they are concerned with what is found and published and how it's published, because it's become so politicized, and it can be politicized. It doesn't have to be, but it so often is. And so in one sense, some of the governments are afraid, okay, you know, if this is found, then it makes our claim to ownership or rulership over this country, you know, less so. And then in another sense, there's also all the religious stuff that's behind that, that's often connected politically, and they don't necessarily want to find stuff that demonstrates the accuracy of the New Testament or the Bible as a whole. And they're also very cautious about the way in which things are found. Like the James ossuary that I mentioned, that had a huge amount of pushback from the Israel Antiquities Authority because it was found illegally, basically. It was turned up on the antiquities market. It wasn't from a normal excavation. But then also compounded that with, it's essentially, we could call it a Christian artifact. So that caused a lot of problems, and many people didn't like it. And there are other artifacts that are similar to that. There's another one that's attributed to Jehoash, and it talks about temple repairs, and that's also one that's sort of criticized as being maybe a forgery, but a lot of studies have shown it's not. As far as getting permits, places, you've got to jump through your hoops, but they don't want to give permits to certain people. So if you're outside of what they see as sort of a person who's very scientific, then they may not want to give you a permit. So there's the whole secular academia aspect of it is in that too. And in fact, that might be the strongest thing, even more so than the religious and the political. So that might be number one, political second, religious third. So there's a lot of different things that could become factors. Mentioning Hancock, like that's a general issue in all of academia, really, is that if you don't say the things that are the consensus, you know, the general consensus, and you question that, then a lot of people are not going to like you, or are going to say that you're not a legitimate scholar, you know, you're a conspiracy theorist or something. But of course, it's important to investigate some different viewpoints and point things out when they look obvious. Just because the general consensus currently is, you know, A, well, why can't the explanation be B? Let's look at this. But that often causes people to retool their entire career because it may have been built off of, okay, this is the worldview, or this is, the way that we look at things. And if we change that, then it looks like we made a mistake. So that's part of it too. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I guess we can wrap it up. I'll be glad to answer one if you want to ask me out there, but let's just conclude then in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we're able to gather here and we're able to study the Gospels, study the evidence outside of the Bible about the life of Jesus that confirms the historical reliability of those books, of many of the people, places, and events in the life of Jesus, and just shows us that our faith is built on historical reality, and that for those who question, why should they believe the Gospels, why should they believe Christianity, that there are many reasons out there. These are just some of them, and hopefully we can give the answers and remember some of this type of material and other things. We thank you for sending your Son, Jesus, for salvation through him. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.